person of Jesus. And if you've grown up in the church, you've heard his name many, many times. If you aren't in the church, you may hear it some, and maybe some not even in the most polite form. But I think there's lots of questions about Jesus, and so hopefully this study helps us understand Jesus better. Hope it's helpful, and we discover what he was all about. So by now in our story, the crowds have grown. We talked about that last week. The crowds have gotten bigger, and big crowds create problems, and they sort of made life difficult for him in some ways. They pressed upon him, almost crushed him, and they were attracted to him because he was able to perform miracles, and who wouldn't be attracted to that? I mean, I'm thinking if Jesus were leading today, the miracles would be in a big attraction, and they were then as well. So they're kind of in this new season, and they really were following Jesus more for the miracles than for the teaching, and so that was really not, Jesus said, I'm not here for that. I'm here to teach a new way. And they were familiar with the Davidic way of living and the Messiah and all that, but he's kind of ushering in something new. And when you usher something new, we talked about it in week 1, he created waves. The church, the leaders, they didn't like him. I mean, he made life tough for them, and he wasn't status quo. He got under their skin because they were doing things and their heart wasn't in the right place. And so Jesus didn't back down from that. And so today he begins kind of a new style of teaching. We've actually studied some of this before, parables. And the parables are just earthly stories with heavenly meanings. That's what we've been. But there are stories that compare. The kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like this. And that word parable means just to compare, to throw 2 sticks down beside each other and then to compare them. And that's what he's doing. He's comparing the kingdom, his kingdom, with something in life. And he almost always chose familiar objects, things that they would be familiar with. Whether today one we're looking at is a farmer and planting seeds. We would understand that because we live in an agricultural community. Now in New York, they might not understand that. New York City, they might not. But we understand some of those things. But he always used familiar objects or something they were familiar with, and we would call them object lessons today, sort of, word pictures. And that was a form of teaching that he began here and really spoke in many, many parables all the way through. And so we're not going to spend time looking at each and every parable. We'd be here a long time. In fact, I think he shares 4 with us. The book of Matthew includes 3 extras that Mark doesn't even include. And so he spoke often in parables. But we're going to look at that a little bit today. So hopefully these will be on the screen for you. Mark chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. And he began to teach beside the sea. And a very large crowd gathered about him, so that he got into a boat and sat in it on the sea, and the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. And he was teaching them with many things in parables, and his teaching he said to them. So you can just picture a big lake, a memorial park, the crowd's so big he can't speak. So he goes in a boat, and that's kind of his podium for the day, and they're listening to him teach. And he begins to, and I like what he says in verse 3. Listen. Pay attention. Sounds like a parent, doesn't it? Hey, listen up. Sounds like a coach. I don't know how many times I had to tell my junior high boys basketball team, listen up. We call a timeout. They're all, listen, this is our plan, all right? Jesus says, listen, okay? He said, behold, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured it. Other seed fell on rocky ground, where it did not have much soil, and immediately it sprang up, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and yielded no grain. And other seeds fell into good soil and produced grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold. And he said, he who has ears, let him hear. Who knows? Maybe there was someone nearby that sowing right next to the Sea of Galilee, and he just used that as an object lesson. We don't know. But they understood what he was talking about. We understand about sowing seed. We don't do it by hand very often anymore. We have big equipment, and it sows seed. And in faith, the seed's planted, and we trust it to grow. But the quality of soil is very, very important. And so we understand what he's talking about that. And so our techniques are different. But a seed that is sown, it can fall on different soils. And a seed falling on the road becomes harvest for birds. It doesn't grow there. Seeds falling on rocky ground may come up quickly, but with shallow soil and rock underneath, it's going to wither and die when the sun comes out. I'm amazed at the farm fields here. I'm from Iowa, and our farm fields here are different. They're much rockier, and it's just luck of the draw, I call it. So I appreciate these farmers. You guys work hard at taking care of your fields, and you can see when you drive down the roads, big piles of rocks, and I'm just amazed that that's a yearly thing for people, and you have to take care of the soil, and you have to work it and make it, because if you don't, you know you're not going to have a harvest. It's going to be difficult if you plant on the rocky ground. Also, that might have been the way they planted there. They might plant in field strips, and that strip in the middle where they walk and harvest on the sides, if seed fell on that, it was going to get trampled, or it was hardened, and it wouldn't grow there. Seeds falling among the thorns would be choked out. No crop if you sow where the weeds and the thorns grow. My yard would be a good example of that. My yard looks green, but there are more dandelions than grass some places, and for sure more creeping Charlie than grass. All right. And what happens is we could sow seed, but that seed's never going to take root because it's going to get choked out. I understand that passage. Maybe you do too. And that's what weeds and thorns and those rough weeds do. They don't allow what we want to grow sometimes. I used to think this story was really about the soils, represented 4 types of people. People who remained all their life. We're just one of those people. Some were always hard-hearted, like the first example Jesus gave, hard-heartedness. We can probably think of people that are hard-hearted. Hopefully we're not on those lists. Okay? Some were impulsive. Some would make a decision, hey, I'm going to go to church, I'm going to get involved, boom, 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 and just 3 months later they're done. We don't see them. Nothing took root. It was shallow ground. They were impulsive. We've known people like that. Maybe we've been that way at times in our life. Start off with joy, but then there's something new that comes along, a new trend, new political view, new books, new something, and they jump into that. And they just go from one thing to the next. They never really take root. We used to laugh at Bible Camp for the Risen Son in Louisville, Nebraska. It would be the same people who would come forward and rededicate their life year after year after year. Yeah, they were all emotional. But then, shouldn't pick on them, it was probably legitimate, but you could almost guess the same one. They were just impulsive, and they were easily led. Some people were caught up with the various concerns, the things of this life, the desire for godly things, and they said, you'll get choked out. You'll never last. Easy in our Western culture to get caught up in having things. We all like them. But Jesus, I don't think, was referring to people. I think he's referring to the condition of my heart. Is my heart receptive? Is my heart hard? Am I calloused? Or am I shallow? Am I lured by the things of this world? Is that where my heart is? And I think that's maybe what that parable is trying to tell us. And so I would ask you, where is your heart? Like right now, January 2021. What is your heart like? As you think through that story, what is my heart like? Am I hard-hearted? Am I a little calloused? Am I a little flighty, emotional, impulsive? I start something new and don't stick with that. What's my heart? Is it receptive? And Jesus points out, actually later in chapter 8 of this book, and we'll go through that book, he said even disciples, even followers of Jesus can grow hard hearts. We have to be on our guard. And he says, he who has ears, let him hear. He taught in parables for a reason. He had become so popular, and not for the reasons he wanted. And so he shifted gears and said, he who has ears, let him hear. But that meant not everybody kind of got it. It was sort of mysterious. And sometimes that bugs me with this. Jesus, this should be clear to everybody. But Jesus had a plan and a purpose. Doesn't seem right. He shares the mysteries then with his disciples. Seems like Mark reveals more and more of Jesus as we work our way through. But again, the disciples would have been familiar with messianic type things, Davidic things, but Jesus is bringing in something new, something that hasn't been presented with. It was mysterious, and they were the first ones to get this mystery. how to love, how to forgive, how to treat one another. It wasn't about going through the motions, and it was more than ritual. It was built on something different. And so they were getting pictures that probably others didn't have. They'd been with him some already, and he tells them these things. I think there are certain things of life that cannot be explained. Nature explains a lot, science explains a lot, philosophy explains a lot, but there are other mysteries. And Jesus is sharing those mysteries with his disciples. And the mystery of the kingdom. I think that means we don't always understand what God is doing. And I've grown to the place where I'm okay with that. How are the events of this month, how does that fit in with what God is doing in history? Do I trust that the events are being played out according to his plan? That's a mystery to me. I would probably have a different plan, but it's a mystery. So I think it's easy to think God's up there watching us struggle, he's uncaring. I don't think that's the case, and I think we'll get that to the end of the message today. I believe God is involved in all things. And I believe he is working out a purpose, all the while allowing you and me to have free choice. We're not puppets. He gives us a choice, and he has a plan. Mark leaves this out, but Matthew includes it. It said, "For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have been closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart, and turn, I would heal them." It was people who closed their eyes. They weren't ready for all that. They were looking for this different type of leader. And Jesus ushers in a new way, a new and living way, as he calls it. And so he continues in Mark to teach parables. We could spend all day on each parable, okay? We won't. But he talks about a lamp under a basket. That would be us turning on a light switch. He says, who puts a lamp under a basket? You don't do that. That's not what we do. You put a light out there so everything can be seen. And then he follows up with a story about mustard seeds and another one using seeds. And so he was using common things that people understood. They understood you don't put a light and cover it up. That would defeat the purpose. And so I would encourage you to read through those parables and find out what Jesus is saying. We don't have time this morning to dive into them. But the parables, I think what the parables do is make us think for ourselves. We have to think through those. We have to think, what is the meaning? How do we get there? We don't have a government telling us what to do. We can think for ourselves. And I think these parables were making his hearers, the wheels turn, oh yeah, a lamb. Oh yeah, a mustard seed. That's so tiny. But he said, hey, if you have faith. And so I think he spoke in parables to allow people to think for themselves. It gets the wheels spinning. And he doesn't spell it out, boom, 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 boom. He lets us think through it. But I want to wrap up today with, I think, is an incredible story. A story that might challenge you, might challenge your belief in Jesus. Is he really who he said he is? Can he do all these things? And so they leave these places, they go to the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee sat 700 foot below sea level, I believe. I've never been over there. Some of you have. Where's Gary? Gary probably knows. Did you see the Sea of Galilee, Gary?
Several times.
Yeah, and so this story probably comes to life for you if you've been over there. And but Mount Hermon, I believe, is 30 miles away, and it's 9,200 feet in elevation. And so you have high mountains, low lake, warm water coming off the lake, cold water in the mountains, and sometimes they would mix. And the weatherman says a storm's coming. Now, they didn't have a weatherman. And so these storms would come up often on the Sea of Galilee. It wasn't uncommon. And so that's what's happening in our story. I'm guessing several of our disciples were well aware of it. Why? Because they made their living being on the Sea of Galilee. They made their living as fishermen. And so I'm sure they weren't surprised by storms, maybe by the intensity of a storm at times, but it wouldn't have been uncommon for them. And so let's read through that. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, let us row across to the other side, ready to leave the crowd. He said, and leaving the crowd, They took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Not sure what that means, other than he was tired and worn out and said, let's go. And other boats were with him, so they weren't alone. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? Interesting, Mark is the only one that shares the details that he was asleep on a cushion in the back. That suggests to me there was an eyewitness account. It was probably Peter telling Mark this story. Interesting. Usually, especially back then in historical writings, when there was detail, that was an eyewitness account. Otherwise, you could just, hey, they were on the lake. Not everybody includes that. Today, in some of our writings today, there's people write with greater detail and add details. But back then, details were often left out. So that just gives me credibility to this story. But Peter probably shared this with Mark. And they say, don't you care if we drown? Found a video clip. It's a little different. We'll pull that up for you. It just gives us a picture. But I want you to think through. There's a couple places in here that the video goes dark, black, and all it is audio. Make sure you turn that audio up just a little bit so we can hear that well. But it's just an account of the story. And again, it's just to make the wheels turn in our minds.
Storms. Even the most seasoned seafarer trembles at the first clap of thunder on the horizon. Unpredictable, volatile, irrational. The force of a tempest can turn a freighter into a child's bath toy, tossing and turning the vessel at the leisure of wind-blown whitecaps. The Sea of Galilee is known to be particularly prone to sudden storms, abruptly changing character due to its low geographic position in a valley surrounded by hills. Doesn't that seem familiar? Think about it. Isn't it also true that we often experience some of the strongest storms in the deepest of life's valleys? Scripture tells us of one such storm. Following a day of teaching the crowds, a massive squall battered the vessel that carried Jesus and his disciples. Thunder applauded while wind and waves threatened to capsize the boat, striking fear into the hearts and minds of the disciples. Consumed with their bleak fate, the disciples plead, "Who can calm the storm?" Teacher, don't you care if we drown?
Fear,
Addiction,
anxiety, judgment, loneliness,
loneliness, depression,
uncertainty, struggle, broken, needing acceptance, addiction,
anxiety. My whole life I've been surrounded by substance abusers or substances like alcohol or drugs or anything like that, and in various forms. And I fell into it around my sophomore year, and it just was a huge spiral down in my life. Like, I just could never get off of it. I could never stop drinking. I could never stop smoking or doing this or doing that.
So last year I was a freshman and I already felt like I had almost no friends because during my 8th grade year, practically all of my friends abandoned me.
My family went through a phase where there was a big split, and I was caught in the middle of it.
I didn't know anyone who was going through the same things that I was going through.
And it consumed me, you know. It changed completely who I was. It made me into someone who was an aggressor, who was angry all the time, who was hurting and hurtful, you know.
I didn't really know where to look or where to go to.
I had this really big fear of abandonment. I don't know where it came from.
I always care about what are people going to think of me, how are they going to think of the way I dress, the way I look.
I don't even know when it started, but I was young. I was about in 6th grade, and that's where I started my addiction to pornography.
I was the outcast. I never fit in anywhere. People would always look at me and go, oh, it's that guy.
Growing up as a child, I never had that perfect family that everyone, or that I dreamed of. I never had a mom and dad who got along. So I always grew up in a world of fighting.
Loneliness turned into depression. Depression turned into anxiety.
I always felt alone, and I felt like no one was there.
I was about ready to end my life. I just felt so done with life that I was so depressed that I just felt like no one cared for me. I was just so lonely that
Trying to find acceptance.
I didn't see a point in being on this earth.
It's never been easy just doing things for their own reasons. Guys.
Like I thought that no one was gonna want to hang out with me at lunch, or I already felt like wanted to hang out with me after school.
And it consumed me.
Silence. With a single word, the seas became smooth as glass, and the wind was said to have run out of its breath. Who is this that the wind and the waves, mighty as they may be, bow to his call? The only explanation is he is Lord, and he who can calm the raging sea can surely bring to peace the storm surrounding me.
Maybe that gives a better picture of what was going on. Had to be intense. Seasoned fishermen on a lake, used to storms, but this one must have been worse. Water come in the boat, Jesus asleep in the back. Don't you care? Had to be intense. You get this, you get that, paddle, do this, bail. I mean, it had to be going on, and they sort of go like, Jesus, don't you care? Anybody who's walked this journey of faith has probably thought that before. Ever thought that? God, don't you care? Don't you care what's going on in our world? Don't you care? I could get political if I wanted to. Don't you care? Do you love me? And Jesus said, peace, be still. Crazy. Crazy kind of power. And this is what makes it tough. I've never seen anybody do that before. Is it possible that Jesus really could calm the storm just by saying, peace, be still? These are the same words he said to the demon-possessed man. Be still. I don't think it was a slow, the waves start to diminish. I think it was glass. You could see your image in it. Eeriness had to be part of it, just like crazy. I would have pulled out my topwater bass fishing lures and thrown them in that cold water. Peace, be still. Who is this man that can control nature by saying that? And so we have to come, that's a hard faith step. Do I really believe Jesus could do that? come to the conclusion? He can. He can. Doesn't mean he'll do it for us, but he has the power. The disciples were afraid, just like we get afraid sometimes, that we're not being thought about. Don't you care? Don't you love me? We all ask that question. And Jesus responds, why are you so afraid? Well, look around, Jesus. The water's coming over. We're filling up. He says, why are you so afraid? If you'd have loved us, you would ever build in that blank. If you loved me, Jesus, you wouldn't have. If you loved me, you would have. If you're really there, we could fill in the blank. And Jesus says, why are you so afraid? After all they've seen him do, after all they've heard of teaching, I mean, think already what we've seen just in the beginning of Mark of the things that he's done, the miracles that he's done. And I think to myself, why would they be surprised? But it had to be just so monumental. And he just says, peace. Be still. I don't know if it was a loud voice. You know, in my mind as a kid, I was like, peace, be still. You know, God's voice just like, doesn't really matter. He just said, be still. And it seemed they were more afraid after the miracle than they were before. What's it say? And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, who then is this, that even the wind and sea obeyed him? I think they were scared. A respectful scared. I have a little book that I've just enjoyed through the years. Talks about this story. We'll begin to wrap up with that. Let's see here. A book by Mike Yaconelli. He's passed away. He was a youth leader for many years, but he just writes in a fresh way. The book's called Dangerous Wonder. If you like interesting, fun reading, you'll get it. Where do I want to start with this? Jesus called his disciples to a very odd standard of living. Nothing. Obviously, childlike faith is faith that trusts Jesus' standard of living. Seek ye first the kingdom of God instead of modern society's standard of living. Seek ye first the kingdom of things is what we buy into. When our possessions possess us, they imprison us, and risk and adventure become impossible. Interesting. The result? We have lost the gleam in our eye. Jesus no longer chases us into the ragged terrain of our souls. We have forgotten what it's like to stand speechless in the presence of Jesus, hearts beating wildly, staggered and stunned by what God is doing in our world. The obstacles are intimidating, but they need not dictate our lives. We can rediscover the childlike attribute of our faith called dangerous wonder. Do not give up. Dangerous wonder is still possible for us all. You can still experience a volatile mix of astonishment and terror, awe and risk, amazement and fear, adventure and exhilaration, tears and laughter, passion and anticipation, daring and enchantment. Let me remind you of two instances of dangerous wonder. Mary was a young woman, a teenager, a virgin betrothed to be married to a young kid in town, Joseph, a virgin as well. Nazareth was a small town. Joseph's dad was a carpenter, and the young Mary and Joseph were cute and respected by all who knew them. Life was looking good for this youthful couple. Everyone was looking forward to the wedding, and then an angel showed up. Have you ever wondered why every time an angel shows up, the first words out of its mouth are, fear not? The angel announced to Mary that she had found favor with God because she was pregnant, some favor. Great news. All right, because how do you explain this one to your fiance? Instead of a wonderful wedding, the blessing of the community, and a nice predictable life, Joseph and Mary began a nightmarish adventure. Joseph had to embrace a pregnancy that wasn't his. Both of them had to flee the country and live in exile, and they had to deal emotionally with the reality that because of their baby, many innocent babies were slaughtered. Joseph and Mary experienced the dangerous wonder of following an unpredictable God. My hunch is they never regretted their lives. Another instance occurs one night when the disciples were rowing across the lake while Jesus slept in the stern of the boat. A frightening storm surprised them, and before they could prepare, their old and questionable boat was being slammed by 10-foot swells. They were taking in water, and they were in danger of sinking. The disciples were terrified and finally woke Jesus up, screaming in desperation, "We're going to drown!" They must have been thinking, "Hey, you are the Son of God. You make the storms. Do something." Jesus did something. He said, "Be still." And the storm stopped. The water was immediately as calm as glass, and it was eerily still. I have to believe the disciples were petrified. I'll bet they didn't move for 30 minutes until finally one of them leaned over to the other disciples and said, "Don't make him mad." I believe the disciples were more afraid after the storm was calm than during it. The disciples experienced firsthand the dangerous wonder of being with Jesus. We could keep reading. Good stuff. You're welcome to borrow the book if you want. You see, the older we get, I think we lose wonder. We've forgotten what it's like to stand in awe. Isn't that why the older we get, we love watching kids and they make snow angels in the ground, and you just see the wonder of a kid. At Christmas, they see the lights, and their eyes just light up, and we go, "What's happened to us?" And we just kind of go, "Ho hum, Christmas, ho hum," whatever it is. And the older we get, we just sort of get hard-hearted, or we don't care, or we lose the wonder. Guard your heart. Don't lose the wonder. Don't let age and nature do that to you. Speechless they were, hearts beating, in awe and wonder of what God is doing. Maybe they demonstrated what happens to us sometimes. The fear of the disciples might have demonstrated they were closer to the world than they were to the Son of God. Could it be that our fear makes us closer to the world than we are to Jesus? Because if we really believe Jesus is who he said he is, fear seems to work its way out at times. Not that it doesn't creep in, we get that. We deal with anxiety, we deal with those things. But all the time he's like, "Wow, where's your faith?" That's what he said to his disciples. They're afraid for their lives. Where's your faith? Who knows what's next for our world, for our nation? We get fearful. I got a grandson. I get fearful what's next for him as I see the decisions being made. But I got to believe Jesus is who he says he is. I don't have the answers. I can get angry. Or I can just build my life upon his teachings and move forward with confidence and faith, knowing that he cares. We all build our lives on something. That's our own views or our own education or our own pursuits. I believe Jesus is who he said he is. The Son of God. And I also believe he's going to come back again. So I have to trust, even when I don't know. Even when there's storms in my life, I have to say, he can calm the storm, but he's there with me. Am I fearful? Who's in the boat with you? Do I believe that he can calm the storm? Oh, if you've lost that wonder, it can be regained. That's why we're going through the book of Mark, as we look in awe and wonder at this person of Jesus. Don't lose the childlike faith. We're going to take us into communion. This song just kind of talks about amazement. I don't know, again, the older you get, you sort of lose amazement. Oh yeah, snowflakes, big deal. Oh yeah, frost on the windows, big deal. Oh yeah, a sunrise, big deal. The older we get, we lose our amazement. We're amazed that a guy can throw a football down the field and hit his receiver on the run. What What amazes you? The disciples were in awe, amazed. As we sing, reflect on the amazing God that sent his son down to earth to die on a cross for your sins and for my sins. I get it. Not always easy to have that faith. Did that really happen? You have to come to that belief on your own. Study his life. Study what he was all about. Make a decision. And bask in the wonder and awe of a Savior who loved you. Let's stand. The song's over. We invite you to come to one of our stations, participate in communion. Again, approach it with wonder and awe.
Jesus the Nazarene, and wonder how he could love me, a sinner condemned, undone.
Thank you for joining us as we study this person of Jesus. And maybe it's been a long time, and maybe you'll discover he's a little different than I remembered. Maybe you've never ever taken the time. I just encourage you, if you're brand new, or read the Bible with fresh eyes and go, who is this Jesus? Is he really who he said he was? And if he was, then we have a decision to make. And some say, I don't think so. I think it's a fairy tale. Some say, no, I really put my belief and trust. And I would encourage you, if you have questions, talk to people. You know, it's hard to get a straight answer from anywhere anymore, isn't it? I mean, I think of all that we've gone through. We have this organization says this is what you have to do. You have to wear this, and then they come out and say, no, that doesn't work. You got to do something different. You know what I've decided to do? I go to people I trust. I go to my local healthcare providers and nurses that I know. I say, tell me what you think about this, and I make an informed decision. What else can you do? Because we don't know what we can trust anymore. We don't know. And so I'd encourage you to do the same thing with Jesus. Read it, study him, talk to someone who's gone and said, yeah, I've done that, or no, that's not for me. Gather some information and make an informed decision on who this Jesus is. I happen to think your response is the most important response to anything you'll ever respond to in your life. But I'm a pastor, so that comes with the territory. But I would encourage you, read the Gospels. There's lots of good information about who this Jesus is, and pursue it. Pursue it. Let's stand, we'll pray, and we'll be dismissed. Father, thank you for the words that were recorded. Eyewitness accounts. And yeah, sometimes our faith is minimal, and sometimes we question ourselves, do I really believe those things? They just seem out there. They don't seem to be part of our experience. And yet, testimony has thousands of years later. People who have committed to that way of life. People who've gone to their deathbeds, the disciples. No way they would have gone and given up their life for a lie. So we gain truth from others' testimonies. But I thank you for this person of Jesus. Thank you that he can command the wind and the waves. Help us to be in awe of his love and his power, but also give us a trust. We pray in Jesus' name.